Animations are getting more common in a lot of modern applications. So in this section, I'm going to teach you how to add animations to your Angular apps. By the end of this section, you will have a good understanding of the structure of animations. You'll be able to animate various elements in the DOM. You'll be able to create reusable animations. You will learn how to work with the new animation functions in Angular 4.3. And finally, I will show you how to write clean and maintainable animation code. This section is about 1.5 hours long, so it's best to watch it over 2 sessions. Now, let's get started. Alright, first, let me show you the kind of animations you're going to build in this section. So here's one example. Here we have this to-do list. When I refresh the page, these items, these elements are going to appear with an animation. So let's have a look one by one. I'm going to refresh the page. Let's have a closer look. So our heading slides down. Let's have a look, refresh, slide down. One more time, slide down, right? Now our items, they appear with a fade in effect. So have a look here, refresh, see, one more time, nice. Now, also note that these items, they don't appear all together at the same time. They appear one after another. So we have the first item, then the second item, then the third item. Let's have a look, refresh. Did you see? One more time. This is what we call the staggering effect, like a curtain. Now also, if I add a new item here, here is my new task. Again, it appears with a fade in effect. And look what happens when I click an item to remove it. The background turns red, then the item slides to the right for a fraction of a second, and then it quickly slides to the left of the screen. Let's have a look. Did you see? So here's one example. So I'm going to comment out the to-dos element and bring in the zippy. By the way, I have attached this project as a zip file. So if you want to play with it, download it and run it, you can see all these animations on your machine as well. But we're going to build all these step by step in this section. So don't worry if you don't understand the code. Now let's take a look at this zippy. So this is our zippy. Now when I click this zippy is going to expand with an animation, and then the content will fade in. Have a look. Did you see? It's a very nice animation. So these are the 2 examples we'll be working on in this section, but the principles you learn here, you can apply them to build various kinds of animations. There are 2 primary ways to create animations in web applications. We can use CSS and JavaScript. In CSS, we have a couple of properties like transition and animation. And with these properties, we can animate DOM elements. So here's an example. I've defined a CSS class called stretch. In this class, we have 2 properties, animation name and animation duration. When we apply this class to a DOM element, the browser will animate that element, okay? Now, if you have been working with CSS for a while, chances are you have heard of a library called animate.css. So if you go to Google and search for animate.css, all right, look at this first link here. So this is a library that gives us a bunch of predefined classes for various kinds of animations. So we don't have to manually build these animations with CSS properties. So here's an example. From this drop-down list, you can select an animation and then see that animation in action. See? That's the bouncing effect. Okay? Now here's another example. You've got pulse. So very simple and beautiful animation. You can look at their GitHub page. It's very easy to use. All you have to do is install this animate.css via npm, then add it to your HTML files, or in Angular world, you need to import it into styles.css, just like how we imported Bootstrap into our styles.css. Okay? And then finally, all you have to do is to apply these classes on your elements. It's really easy to use. I'm not going to go over this more because our focus here is purely on Angular and not CSS. So, as you saw, we can certainly use CSS to create animations, but these CSS animations give us limited control. So we often use these for simple one-shot animations like showing a tooltip or toggling UI element states. If you want to build something more complex that needs fine-tuned control, then you really need to use JavaScript. Now, in terms of the implementation, there are various libraries out there that give you an API for implementing animations in JavaScript. I personally have used jQuery before, but there are many other libraries out there. But the recommended approach is to use the Web Animations API, which is basically a specification for animating DOM elements, and is currently supported natively in Chrome, Firefox, and Opera. So if you head over to caniuse.com, on this page, you can see what features are implemented in what browsers. So let's search for Web Animations API. Now, here you can see Web Animations API is widely supported in Firefox, Chrome, and Opera. Microsoft Internet Explorer and Edge, just like always, are behind the game. But don't worry, because there are polyfills that you can install, and then you can use Web Animations in these other browsers. Now, what does our code look like? Here's an example. So we get a reference to a DOM element, and then we can call the animate method on that element. As simple as that. So there are basically two ways to create animations in web applications. You can use CSS and or JavaScript. But where does Angular come in this picture? Well, Angular has a module called Angular Animations. And this module is built on top of the standard Web Animations API. So instead of us directly working with this API, we're going to work with the abstractions provided by Angular. The benefit is that our code is going to be easier to unit test and also easier to port to a different platform. So when we code against these abstractions, then potentially we can take our code and run it inside an iOS or an Android environment and use animations natively in that environment. So we are not tightly coupled to the implementation of web animations in browsers. Next, we're going to look at animations in Angular in more detail. So in the last lecture, you learned about two ways to create animations. Now let's see how we can build animations in our Angular apps. So as I told you before, in Angular, we have a module called Angular/animations. In this module, we have a bunch of helper functions for creating animations such as trigger, transition, state, animate, and so on. Before we explore these functions in detail, let's take a look at the anatomy of an animation. Look at this illustration. What you see here is the concept behind every animation. Whether you're a programmer or an animator, you're dealing with the same concept. So what does this mean? This means an element, or here more accurately, a DOM element, can be in any given state. Let's say state 1. In this state, it has a certain look and feel. Perhaps its background is blue. Now, during an animation, it transitions to a different state, and in this state, it has a different look. Perhaps its background is now yellow. This is the anatomy of every animation. We have various states. In each state, our element has a different look, and during an animation, it transitions from one state to another. Okay? Now, what are these states? Well, in Angular, we have three kinds of states. We have the void state, the default state, and custom states. Let's explore each of these. The void state represents the state of an element that is not part of the DOM. And this can happen when an element is created but not placed in the DOM yet, or when it's removed from the DOM. Here's a real-world example. Think of a to-do list. Every time we add an item in the list, the corresponding element is first created, but it's not in the DOM yet. So it's in the void state. Then it transitions from this state into a new state. Similarly, when we delete an item from the list, the corresponding element transitions from its current state into the void state. So here, This asterisk represents what we call the default state. So all elements do have a default state. Now back to the list of states. One more time, we have three types of states: the void state, the default state, which is indicated by an asterisk, and also custom states. We don't always use custom states because they only make sense in certain scenarios. For example, think of a zippy or an accordion component. This component is always visible in the view, but its state can change from collapsed to expanded. So if you want to implement an animation during this transition, then we'll have to work with two custom states here: collapsed and expanded. So this is the big picture. Now let's take a look at the implementation. Let's say we want to apply an animation to each to-do item in a list. We start with the component's metadata. Here we have a property called animation, which takes an array. In this array, we register one or more triggers. Each trigger has a name and an implementation. In this implementation, we define all the states and transitions for that kind of animation. So these functions you see here, like trigger, state, and transition, these are the helper functions that are defined in angular/animations module. You're going to see this in action soon. So here we have a trigger called fade in. Now we can apply this trigger on any DOM element using this notation. So we use an @ sign followed by the trigger name. So this is the big picture. Next, we'll create our first animation. All right, we're ready to implement our first animation. Now, if you want to code along with me, which I highly recommend you to do so, download the zip file I have attached to this lecture. Then, just as usual, run npm install, and finally, ng serve. So in this application, we have a simple to-do list. We can add a new to-do item, and we can delete existing items by clicking them. Now, currently, we don't have any animation here, and that's what we're going to implement over the next few lectures. So back in VS Code, the first step is to import the animations module into app module. So let's go to app.module. On the top, I'm going to import browser animations module from @angular/platform-browser/animations. So this module includes all the code for running animations in a browser. Now we need to import this into our module. So browser animations module. Now, as I told you before, this browser animations module is implemented on top of the standard web animations API. And this API is natively supported in Firefox, Chrome, and Opera. So to support the other browsers, you need to add polyfills. Polyfill is basically code that allows you to use modern JavaScript features in older browsers. So back here in the source folder, you can see we have a TypeScript file called polyfills. Now, if you scroll down, on line 40 and 41, you can see a commented line for importing web animations polyfill. So here we need to remove the comment. And as you can see in the comment in front of this line, you need to manually install this node module, web-animations-js. So back in the terminal, npm install web-animations-js. And remember the save flag. So this is how we add animation support to an existing application. First, we import the browser animations module, and then we add web animations polyfill to support older browsers. Next, we're going to implement our first animation. All right, let's go to our to-dos component. So to-dos.ts. So here we have a basic to-dos component. Now in the component metadata, we're going to add a new property, animations. And we set this to an array. In this array, we define one or more triggers. So we call the trigger function, which comes in angular/animations library. Let's import this on the top. And by the way, look here, we have a couple of options. One is to import this from angular/animations. The other is to import it from angular/core. Initially, the animation functions were part of the core Angular module. But starting from version 4 or 4.1, I don't exactly remember, Angular team moved these functions into a different module called angular/animations. So be sure to import all these functions from angular/animations. Okay? Now here we need to give this trigger a name. So let's call this fade. And then as a second argument, we need to pass an array. In this array, we register all the states and the transitions to implement this animation. Okay? So we have a trigger called fade. Before going any further, let's go to our template and apply this trigger. So todos.html. So this is where we render all the to-do items. Each to-do item is a button, and here you can see I've applied the ng4 directive. So I'm going to apply our trigger using this notation, @, and then the name of the trigger, fade. Okay? If you don't do this, you're not going to see the animation. Okay? So back in the component. Now here in this array, we need to register all the states and the transitions for this animation. So we often have calls to two functions. One is the state function, and the other is transition. Again, both these functions are defined in angular/animations. So let's quickly import them from angular/animations. Now it's easier to start with this transition function. So I'm going to temporarily delete this line, and we'll come back to it later. Now, this transition function requires two arguments. The first one is a string, and this is what we call a state change expression. With this expression, we define the source and the target states. So here's an example. Void goes to default. That means when our element goes from the void state to the default state, then here we add an array. And in this array, we define the steps that should run during this animation. Okay? So in order to implement a fade-in effect, we want to apply certain styles during this transition when the element is created, but it's not placed in the DOM yet. Here, often we have calls to two functions. One is the style function, and the other is the animate function. What are these? Well, first of all, let's import both of these from angular/animations. Okay. Starting with the style function. This function takes an object, and this object contains one or more key value pairs where keys are CSS properties. So if I want to change the background color of this element during this transition, I can set that here. Background color to yellow. I can also set the opacity here. Opacity 0. So this style function will apply these styles here immediately during this transition. Okay? Now the animate function is similar, but it takes two arguments. The first argument is the timing. So let's say 2000 milliseconds. And the second argument is the style object. So I'm going to apply two styles. Background color, white, and opacity 1. So this animate function will apply these styles over this period of time, in this case 2 seconds. That's the only difference between the style and animate functions. The style function applies the styles immediately, but the animate function applies them over a period of time. So when we run this code, the background color of our element is going to be initially yellow, and then over 2 seconds, it will gradually change to white. Also, similarly, their opacity will be initially 0, and then it will gradually change to 1. Let's see this in action. Save, back in the browser. Refresh. Okay, look, our items initially had a yellow background, but that changed to white over 2 seconds. Now back to our component, let's make this code a little bit cleaner. Here on line 12, where we call the animate function, we can totally delete the second argument. We don't need to explicitly tell Angular to change the background color to white and the opacity to 1. Because Angular is smart enough to know that in the target state, which is the default state here, our items should have a white background and their opacity should be 1. So we don't need to explicitly specify them here. So let's delete the call to the style function. Okay, that's cleaner. So here's the lesson. In the list of steps in a transition, if you have a call to the animate function with only a timing value without any styles, this animate function is going to undo all the previous styles applied over this period of time. So because earlier we changed the style of our to-do items, this animate function is going to make any necessary changes to undo these styles. Okay? Also, for the fade effect, we don't really need this background color. I just added this as a demonstration. So here's how we implement the fade in effect. When an element transitions from the void state to the default state, initially we want to set its opacity to 0, which will make this element invisible. And then over a period of time, in this case 2 seconds, we want to change that opacity to 1, which will make the element appear on the view. So here on this page, if we add a new item, it will appear with a fade in effect. So a new item. There you go. However, if we click an item, it will disappear immediately. There's no animation. Let's have a look. See? They disappear immediately. So let me show you how to implement a fade out effect here. Back to our component, in the animations metadata property, we defined a trigger called fade. In this trigger, we have a transition from the void state to the default state. Now we want to define another transition from the default state to the void state. Because when we click an item, it's going to be removed from the DOM. At this point, it will go from the default state to the void state. So here, I'm going to define a second transition from the default state to the void state. And here are the steps. During this transition, we want to change the opacity of this element from 1 to 0 over a period of time. And this will make the element fade out. So, because we want to change the style over a period of time, we're going to call the animate function. So animate, we give it a timing value, let's say 2000 milliseconds, and then we set the style. So we want to change the opacity to 0 over 2 seconds. That's all we have to do. Let's test this. Back in the browser, I'm going to click this item. Now it fades out. Here's another example. Beautiful. So this is our implementation of the fade in and fade out effects. In this implementation, as you see, we have something that is duplicated. That is this style object here. How can we make this code cleaner? Well, if you pay close attention here, this is the style of the element in the void state. So when the element is out of the DOM, its opacity should be 0. So to clean up this code, we can define this style for the void state. So earlier I told you that here in the trigger, we often have calls to the transition and or state functions. So here we can call the state function to define a state. State. The first parameter is the name. So here we want to work with the void state. Now look at the second parameter. The type of this parameter is animation style metadata. This might sound a little bit confusing, and in fact, a lot of functions in the animations module, their parameters look something like this. So they always have animation blah 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 metadata. Now here's a tip for you. Whenever you see types like that, drop the animation and metadata words. So here if we drop these, what do we have? Style. That means we should call the style function to get a style object. Okay? So we call style. And here we can set the style of this element in the void state. So opacity 0. And then we don't have to repeat this in 2 places. So we can delete it from here and also here. So once again, inside a trigger, we often have calls to the state and or transition functions. Most of the time, we use the transition function, but depending on what we're implementing, we may use the state function to make our code cleaner and more maintainable. Now, one last thing before we finish this lecture. On Angular website, when you search for animation functions, you will see 2 versions of these functions. So here's an example. Let's say you want to read about the style function. Let's search. Okay, look, here we have 2 instances. Let's click on the first one. You can see this function is defined in angular/core package. So as I told you before, initially, all the animation functions were defined in this package. But starting from Angular 4 or 4.1, Angular team moved these functions into a separate package. However, for compatibility, they have kept these functions in the Angular/core package, but they will be deprecated soon. So now, back here, let's click on the second one. You can see this function is defined in Angular/animations package, and it has the full documentation. So continuing from the last lecture, we still have a little bit of duplication in our code. So look, we have repeated this animate 2000 milliseconds in 2 places. So let me show you a cleaner way to implement the fade in and fade out effect. In the transition function, as the first argument, we can supply multiple state change expressions. So here, I can add a comma and add the other state change expression. That is, the default state goes to void. And then we can delete this second transition. Better, right? But we can make this even cleaner. So instead of having 2 unidirectional state change expressions, we can have a bidirectional state change expression. So I can delete this second expression and make this bidirectional. This is much better from where we started. So here's the lesson. If you have multiple transitions, and these transitions have the same implementation, you can refactor them into one transition with multiple state change expressions. Also here we have a couple of aliases. So let me revert this back to what we had earlier. These 2 expressions are very common. So in Angular, we have an alias for these expressions. So for the first one, when the element transitions from the void to the default state, our alias is enter. So we add colon, enter. And for the second expression, our alias is leave. So that's when the element is leaving the DOM, like this. So using these aliases, in my opinion, is cleaner and more readable than a bidirectional state change expression like this. But if you prefer the other syntax, by all means, go for it. I'm going to delete this. So this is all about transitions. So we have defined this fade trigger in our to-dos component. And chances are somewhere else in our application, you may want to apply a fade effect to another element. We don't want to repeat all this code. So it's better to extract this code and put it into a different module that we can reuse in multiple places. So back in the app folder, I'm going to add a new file, animations.ts. In this file, we're going to define our reusable animations. Now, if you have a lot of animations, instead of one file, you may want to create a directory, and in that directory, you will have different files for different kinds of animations. But for this example, that's an overkill. So Back in our component, this trigger is basically a function that is defined in angular/animations module. So if you look at the return type, it returns an animation trigger metadata object. Once again, as a tip, I told you, whenever you see these types, drop the words animation and metadata. So this trigger function returns a trigger object. All we have to do is export a trigger object from our animations module. So I'm going to select all this code, cut it, back to the new module, export a variable, let's call this fade, and set it to the return value of this trigger function. Now let's clean up the code. Finally, we need to import all these functions from angular/animations package. So back to our component. On the top, I'm going to cut this line and move it to this new module. Beautiful. Now we can reuse this fade trigger in multiple places. So back to our component. Here in this array, I'm going to add the fade trigger. So fade, and you can see this is defined in the animations module. All right, now it's time for an exercise. So I want you to implement a slide animation like this. If I refresh this page, look, elements slide from the left side of the screen. One more time. That's it. If I add a new item here, publish a new section, look, it slides from the left to the right. And when we click an item, it slides to the left side of the screen and exits. Now here's a tip for you. In order to implement the slide animation, you need to apply the transform CSS property. When you set this to translate X, you can move an item to the left or to the right side of the screen. Next, you can see my solution.
Hi, thank you for watching my Angular tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with others. Also, you can subscribe to my channel for free new videos every week. This video is part of my complete Angular course with almost 30 hours of high quality content where you will learn everything about Angular from the basic to the advanced topics all in one course, so you don't have to jump from one tutorial to another. In case you're interested, you can get this course with a big discount using the link in the video description. And if not, that's perfectly fine. Continue watching as the next section is coming up.